Is there such a thing as a truly multi-purpose coffee grinder? One that can handle espresso and drip equally well? Most prosumer machines are aimed in one direction or the other, although some are fairly flexible. But this unit here, called the AllGround, is marketed as a solution to both espresso and brewing, with burrs designed specifically for adaptability. I know a lot of viewers would like to see a machine that can do it all without compromise. So I'm going to take a close look at the AllGround, which is manufactured by Fiorenzato and sold by them and by Sanremo, which offers them in different colors. The machines are otherwise identical. Let's see if these new titanium-coated burrs, also designed and made by Fiorenzato, work equally well at both ends of the spectrum. I'll be testing this grinder with espresso, a Moka pot, and V60 pour-over. I'll compare it to the Eureka SingleDose for pour-over and Moka pot, and against the Niche Zero and the SingleDose for espresso. The AllGround costs a good deal more than either of those two worthy competitors, but hey, if it handles all of its tasks like a champ, it would be like two grinders. I will be doing a teardown as usual. The company supplied me with this loaner unit and asked me to do all of my testing and evaluation before pulling it apart. I've edited some of the footage together, but all of the tests were done on the machine as supplied out of the box. All right, we've got a lot to cover today, so pour yourself a cup and settle in comfortably while I put her to the test. Oh my God.
It's like a miracle.
It's a big unit. It weighs around 9 kilos and stands pretty tall with the hopper in place. Still, it should fit beneath most kitchen cabinets. Let's start with a few specs. It's got 64mm burrs with a titanium coating, rated for 1,400 kilos, or, about 1,000,000 shots. The motor draws 250 watts and runs at 1,400 RPM at 50 Hz. There's no cooling fan for the motor, and the company recommends running a maximum of 1 kilo a day through it, so clearly not a commercial machine, but the components are very solid. The grind adjustment collar is marked with 3 ranges: brewing, Moka pot, and espresso. The touchscreen display changes color and behaves differently according to the range you select. It's very bright, high resolution with good contrast, and it's clearly visible in direct light. It looks great. The adjustment is clicky, precise, and repeatable. The mechanism isn't threaded, it's an angled or inclined tongue and groove system with virtually no lash. The collar remains parallel to the burrs, evenly pressing the upper carrier against spring pressure distributed to 4 points. The machined inner ring surface makes flush contact with the carrier's shoulder. This machined ledge here between the yellow triangle and the red stripe. Adjusting it feels good, and very small movements correspond to noticeable changes. Routine cleaning could not be easier. Turn the ring, press this button, and voila! The upper half of the grind chamber comes away without any tools. Brush it or vacuum it, and you're back up and running in a matter of seconds. That allows for disassembly and reassembly without recalibration. Indeed, there's no calibration mechanism because it doesn't need one. When you reassemble it, you'll find all of your grind settings right where you left them. These are features you find on commercial machines more often than prosumer ones. The chute liner is held in place magnetically, which lets you remove it conveniently to reach higher with a brush. But there's virtually no retention. I wait about 15 minutes after grinding to let any static charge dissipate and let it rock forward and stop suddenly. And as you can see, it's better than a lot of single-dose grinders. It's relatively quiet, roughly comparable to the Niche Zero, both idling and grinding. This is not a scientific test. You need a proper sound meter, which costs thousands, and a controlled environment to say how loud something is objectively. But this simple phone app is good enough for comparisons. The noise here is typical. The quality of it is, well, not at all irritating. Now, what about single dosing, I hear you wondering? I found that the AllGround can be used as a single doser with a little encouragement and some adjustment to the grind time. However, it's designed as an on-demand grinder, leveraging some downforce from the weight of the beans, so that's how I tested it in most situations. I always like to start with the burr alignment ink test because it gives me an idea of how well the components are made and assembled and how strict the quality control is. I like to rotate the lower carrier with small vice grips that make a firm connection with the fastener here so that I can feel the burr contact area as I turn it. Obviously, you wouldn't use this to tighten or loosen the fastener, but for what I'm doing, a socket would have too much lash to provide a good feel. This grinder is a bit crowded up here, so I'll use this spring clamp instead. It makes a good connection with less bulk. I can tell by feel that the burrs are making flush or nearly flush contact. Now, people often make too much of this test. Under a load, such as grinding coffee beans, the burrs will shift and chatter because there has got to be play in any system that's adjustable. A test like this doesn't tell you about the running conditions. It shows only the starting condition. And as you can see, the alignment is perfect. No ink on the flats means there's nothing to adjust. This is as good as it gets. Again, this doesn't mean that the burrs will stay in perfect alignment under a load, but the care of manufacture and attention to detail here are obvious. I press the carrier manually because the adjustment range is such that you can't run the burrs together, which is good since titanium is a fairly abrasive material, so dry running is not something I recommend. Let's look briefly at the differences between these and the Eureka SingleDose burrs, which are the same size and similar in purpose and design. Both have 20 breakers, but the AllGround has more and finer cutting blades and narrower flats. The Eureka's blades are a bit coarser, but the basic designs here are fairly close. Something like these Ditting ceramics are noticeably different, with only 8 breakers, very short blades, and narrow flats. This design gives you a lot of fines and a lot of splintering as opposed to slicing. Great espresso burrs, by the way, but they fail hard on pour-over. The Fiorenzato and Eureka burrs are similar enough that I wouldn't expect dramatically different flavors from them, but we'll see. Our test subject is a washed Ethiopian garden variety, nothing too fancy, which I roasted for general use. The adjustable portafilter rest is coated with a gummy plastic that dampens noise and chatter and prevents wandering. The coffee lands perfectly centered and very lightly, so there's no need to move the portafilter around. This is fluffy and beautifully distributed. I can feel with this little gizmo, which I twist slightly, that the resistance is the same everywhere. You can just give it a smack to flatten the mound and go straight to tamping. So a great workflow here. No dosing ring or funnel needed, nor should one be at this price. I've seen a lot of expensive grinders where you don't get a great automatic fill. This is excellent. Once your coffee is dialed in, there's no hint of any mechanical issues in the basket. I would say it equals the Niche Zero for ease of use. If you make a lot of espresso, you're going to love this in terms of workflow and dialing in. You can program 2 grind times. When the machine stops, or when you stop it, you can press the hand symbol to dispense a little extra manually. However, I had occasional issues with the touchscreen. The controls behaved as expected most of the time, but occasionally the power would cut out prematurely. I thought it might just be down to a loose wire connector or something like that. Intermittent problems are exasperatingly hard to diagnose. Shot after shot without a hint of mechanical flaws, like channeling or wandering pressures or shot times. I was unable to grind for Turkish coffee. The beans just didn't want to feed with the burrs set that close together. I hope you can see this well enough. The bottom of the grind chamber, the lower carrier surface here, is a bit high in relation to the burrs. I think that probably accounts for it. So if Turkish coffee is important to you, you might want to think twice. So, flavor. Okay, compared to the Eureka SingleDose, which is a respectable espresso grinder similar to the Specialita, well, I have to give a slight edge to the AllGround. There was just a bit more subtlety, complexity, and richness. Compared to the niche Zero with conical burrs, well, now you're talking about a different animal. The Zero is going to emphasize the lower end and give you richer coffee with more texture and still plenty of complexity. If I had the AllGround alone, I wouldn't pine for the Zero, but I'd rather not have to make that choice, especially being a robot user. The bot is temperature limited to around 90 degrees Celsius. It makes great espresso, but it naturally favors darker roasts and finer grinding. It's all of a piece. The Robot Zero combo gives you more of that bittersweet, earthy flavor and rich texture. Most good flat burr grinders tend to give you more brightness and mid-range complexity, and this one is no exception. If you like a flat burr grinder for espresso, the AllGround would be a sound choice. Its ease of use and workflow make it hard to beat. The Moka pot funnel sits comfortably on the portafilter rest. With a bit of height adjustment, it's quite secure. As we saw previously, the dosing is neat and precise. There's no mess on the bench. I'll be using this E&B Lab Moka Express clone, which has a different upper screen. This is the stock Bialetti one, and here's the E&B one. In my experience, the smaller holes of the E&B produce a bit more back pressure and prefers slightly coarser grinding. I get a nice, slow, steady extraction for a final ratio of 1:3, like a classic single shot of espresso. If you're unclear on how all this works, check out my two videos, Moka Pot Voodoo and Moka Pot Perfection. The puck is firm with no divots, no soft spots, or any evidence of channeling. The inside has no dry sections. It's clearly been saturated evenly throughout, so this grinder did a fine job, mechanically speaking. I'm using the same coffee sample as before. There are no defects in flavor. This is strong, syrupy, and complex. The AllGround and the Eureka SingleDose produce very similar results with the Moka pot. If there's a difference in flavor, it might be a little more brightness and a bit lighter texture coming from the AllGround. But again, the two are quite similar and it's hard to pick out much difference. Now for some V60 pour over. I'll compare this with the Eureka SingleDose. For both brews, I use the same coffee, same ratio, water temperature, and paper, the Cafec T90 in this case. I dialed in both grinders for exactly 4 minutes with 30 grams of coffee and a total of 400 milliliters of water for a yield of 300 milliliters or 1:10. We see the same dosing precision. The catch cup has a rubber boot that I prefer not to use because it's a real chaff magnet. But it does prevent the cup wandering forward from vibration. You need to hold it or place something under it to keep it off of the fork. Still, the coffee falls neatly, and not so much as a particle goes astray. All the company would need to do is make the cup slightly taller so that it misses the fork, and give the boot to the boot. When the cup rests on the bench instead of the fork, it works brilliantly. I used it with a spacer like this pretty much all the time, and it was great. So make this cup 2 inches taller, please. Here I'm comparing mechanical differences reflected in the ground coffee. The aftermath tells the tale. The AllGround is on the left and the SingleDose is on the right. I'm displaying them in different funnels, but they were both brewed in the same one. Notice that we have very similar ratios of fines to larger bits. I see maybe a hair more fines from the AllGround, but the difference is barely noticeable. For these two samples, I've sieved out the chaff so that we can see the surfaces clearly. And of course, along with the chaff come the largest bits. We get similar amounts of boulders, but a bit less for the Eureka, whose burrs have larger flats. A broader flat area will enforce your upper size limit somewhat more strictly, and that's what we're seeing, with the SingleDose producing just under 3 grams of boulders and the AllGround producing just over 4. But effectively, they're the same. You're not going to taste that difference. There's another important test, which is to find the optimal settings for both machines based on flavor. Again, using the Ethiopian sample, but of course without any sieving. We always want to use the entire dose for flavor comparisons. The AllGround did its best work with a finer grind on that coffee, yielding a 6-minute brew with the Cafec T90s. At that point, I found the flavor well balanced and complex. The same was true of the Eureka SingleDose. A finer grind, yielding 5.5 minutes, was ideal. Once again, the flavor profiles are similar, but not identical. I can't say objectively that one tastes better than the other. The AllGround and SingleDose yielded flavor concentration of about equal strength. Both had good complexity. The Eureka coffee showed slightly more body, while the AllGround showed slightly more dynamic range with greater emphasis on brighter flavors and tartness. But they're so similar that you could prefer one to the other on different days, according to your mood. As for my personal preference, well, it's a coin toss. Either grinder, dialed in correctly, will let you brew some delicious coffee. I've got a specialita that I modded with Eureka's brew-specific burrs, and yes, it makes better pour-over than I get from either of these machines. I've got a video about that if you'd like to know why. But in the context of making pour-over with general-purpose burrs, the AllGround is right up there with the Baratza Vario W+, fitted with the Ditting steel burrs that I reviewed recently, and with the Eureka SingleDose and presumably the stock Specialita, which is quite similar. Brew-specific burrs do taste better, but that's to be expected. The AllGround does a fine job throughout the range it covers, and more. I used it for French press at the coarser end of the brewing range, and I really liked the coffee. So yeah, it truly is multi-purpose, with one limitation. Extremely fine coffee ended up with larger bits that I could feel, which would leave Turkish coffee gritty. I doubt that can be tweaked. I suspect it's a function of grind chamber design. So I think Turkish might be out, but from espresso to French press, this machine works. I would call it a good pour-over grinder and a great espresso grinder. Now for the teardown, which I'll follow with a few of my disappointments and finally a discussion of value for money at the end. Alright, let's see what she's made of. If you appreciate heavy-duty construction along with precise build quality, you're going to love this machine. The upper housing and both carriers are carefully machined and fitted well enough to hold the burrs in close alignment as I showed you earlier. I'll turn the lower carrier by hand and look at the runout, about a quarter turn at a time. The grinder sits on hard rubber mounts that compress slightly just from my touch. This indicator is precise enough to show movement from just hand pressure, so we'll give it a second or two to recover. As you can see, the total measured runout is in the range of 0.5 thousandth to 1/1000th. So yeah, pretty much as good as it gets. I've used this machine daily for over a month, so let's remove the entire chute and see how much coffee is stuck behind it. Well, that's hard to beat. I put about 2 kilos through this grinder, and look at how clean it is. Now I'll take off this collar. And now the lower carrier. The underside of which is remarkably clean. the grind chamber design is excellent, especially the wedge shape of the wipers and how precisely they're fitted. There's a crescent spring washer under the spacer which resists loosening from vibration. We've got a nice stout bearing here for the shaft, and an obviously industrial duty motor, and sleeved wiring. I'll take off the base plate now. And would you look at that? Almost no coffee grit at all. The wiring is laid out all right. The capacitor is clipped in place, as it should be. The main power switch and the PCB and its components all look sound. The motor's lower mount is simple and solid, and I won't bother to pull it. It's obviously been done right. I want to move on to the touchscreen, which gave me some trouble. These cover dots are adhesive backed, so I keep them on parchment paper. This is a quality capacitive touchscreen. Everything here looks good except one item. I noticed that this ribbon connector was not squarely seated. There was a bit of an angle to it. The little black plastic strip here is part of a clamp. It has a triangular cross-section. It's a wedge, basically, and it wasn't fully engaged either. I thought, surely this is causing the problem. The failure was intermittent, and this looked like a part that might jiggle loose occasionally from motor vibration. So I reseated the ribbon squarely and made certain the wedge clamp was all the way snug and taped it again. Okay, maybe I got a little carried away with the tape, but I wanted to be sure it wouldn't shift or creep over time. I was pretty confident that I'd found and fixed the issue. So imagine my disappointment when I tried it later, only to see the same behavior. The touchscreen worked a lot of the time, but the power would cut out prematurely at random intervals. I found it very frustrating because I like everything else about this grinder. Here's where it gets comical. I emailed the company with a video clip showing the problem, and they agreed that it must be a defective part. They sent me back a clip of a different machine working as intended, as you can see. They shipped out a second loaner and asked me to try it and see if the fault appeared again. The second one failed in precisely the same way. That was some surprise. Based on the attention to detail, the care of manufacture, and the component quality that I noted while using it and during the teardown, I thought it was next to impossible that two machines would have the same defect and the company wouldn't be aware of it. But what the heck was I looking at? As I said, intermittent problems are maddening to diagnose. But once you've eliminated the sensible explanations, it's time to recognize that you haven't got a sensible problem. You've got a silly problem, for which you need to consider silly explanations. Which I, of course, did. So now, let's look at the clip from Fiorenzato again. I don't think it's presumptuous of me to say that this is probably a woman's hand here. Which gave me an idea. I asked my lovely wife to test both grinders, which she did. She went back and forth between them numerous times, hunting around in all three ranges, and she could not make either of them misbehave. Not even once. But I often did. Next, I tried operating them myself with a very carefully placed fingertip, and sure enough, the problem vanished. Apparently, if your skin overlaps the area around the target, you get a canceling effect. Target areas are a convenient size for women, but not men. So how's that for a silly problem? A sexist touchscreen. So there really isn't a problem after all. There were a few things that I didn't love. The grind adjustment ring feels excellent. It turns smoothly with just the right resistance. The reference marks are printed on a heavy decal that, in this case, doesn't adhere perfectly. Someone at the factory might have got a little enthusiastic with the lubricant, I don't know. But at this price, I expect the adhesive job to be flawless. This is easily fixed, so I'm not worried. In fact, on the second one they sent me, the decal was mounted properly. The portafilter rest is great, solid, perfectly located. but I'd like them to include an Allen wrench for height adjustment. Not everybody has one. A customer should not have to nip out to the hardware store simply to adjust their new grinder. The touchscreen surface can get dull with use and look a little cloudy or smeary from some angle. You need to wipe it down fairly often, but viewed head-on, it always looks great. The machine boots up very slowly. You might wonder sometimes if it's plugged in. A power indicator LED would not be a bad idea. The touchscreen might be fine, but I would still like a mechanical on-off switch, just in case. A spring-loaded bump switch that bypasses the touchscreen would be perfect. You could use whichever one you prefer. I don't like the idea of a machine that I can't use at all if the touchscreen were to fail. As I mentioned, the rubber boot for the catch cup can be irritating. In terms of neatness, it's unnecessary and even counterproductive. A slightly taller cup would be a better solution, I think, or a little stand or spacer. These 2 points on the end of the gate valve are not pleasant to handle. If this were my grinder, I would put a radius on them. There is also short clearance between the valve and the adjustment ring. The gate's location is good because you can close it on a full hopper and lift it away without spilling any beans, but my hand keeps getting caught here. I can rotate the hopper a full 360 degrees, but the valve's position never feels quite right. I'm either getting pinched or poked. The most comfortable position is with the handle at 12 o'clock and the points at 6. The bean hopper is a good size, an attractive shape, and I believe it's made of polycarbonate. The lid is tough and fits perfectly, I'm guessing high-density polyethylene. A hole with no apparent purpose here indicates that this is a carryover part adapted from a different model. Part of the adaptation might have involved breaking off a plastic piece in the neck. The irregular edge here is not something your fingers will encounter routinely, so this is really just nitpicking, which is one of the things I do. Now let's talk about money. This unit costs around 800 euros, excluding duties, taxes, and freight, so about twice what you'll pay for the Eureka SingleDose or the Niche Zero in my part of the world. Of course, this is more like an entry-level commercial machine, although, as I noted, the motor isn't cooled, so it's not meant for commercial duty. But for the most part, it's built that way and it performs that way. You can work it hard and it will still last a long time. If you appreciate industrial overbuilding with really snug tolerances, you're going to love this for under 1,000 euros. It's not quite an EK43, but it's not far from it, and it costs like a third as much. Value for money is a tricky issue. There are 2 main considerations. First, in terms of grinding performance, well, it's only a bit better than several others in its class. But second, in terms of quality, the value for money here is high, especially with espresso. You'll get a smooth workflow, great repeatability, and exceptional ease of use. Like with the Niche Zero, dialing in is an absolute breeze. You could cross-shop this with the Teardown E5SD, a comparably priced machine that also has fancy coated burrs. You could think about the Eureka Atom 75 or the Mazzer Super Jolly, depending on your market. I know that outside of Europe they can be expensive, but here in the EU they can be had pretty reasonably. Would I buy it as my only grinder? Well, if I were making mostly espresso and using other methods occasionally, yeah, I would. It's a great espresso grinder, and it has range. It's not a great pour-over grinder, but it is quite good. If you're doing, say, 60-70% espresso or more, this machine starts to make a lot of sense. Well, that's about all for today. Coming up very soon, I'll let you know about a new grinder from Eureka. And then I'll visit the other end of the price scale with a close look at the Urbanic Budget Grinder. After that, I'll be buying a really deluxe new coffee machine because we'll be diving into espresso more deeply for a while. There's a lot I want to cover there. I'm also toying with the idea of evaluating a few commercial grinders to see how that plays. So keep in touch. Cheers!